this might be a good one to wrap up on.
Sure.
From Christopher Ankerson, what would you suggest would be the top concrete actions that a new administration should take to reset, in quotes, the U.S.-China relationship?
So, Chris, thank you so much, and just thank you for just being such a wonderful supporter and mentor and friend. I'm really, really glad that we got to your question. So it's going to be difficult, and I don't think that anyone labors under any illusions about the challenge. I think there are a few thoughts that come to mind. First, I think before we even think about China, I think that the United States, in order to enable itself to be more competitive and to think properly about its relationship with China, it needs to pursue in parallel those two tracks that I mentioned earlier. Domestic renewal is absolutely essential to not only to just restoring our capacity, our material capacity to act as a galvanizer of collective action, but also just to reassure our allies and partners that they can make common cause with us, and that there's going to be that we've rehabilitated our domestic crisis management capacity, that we have the ability to manage our domestic crises, get our own house in order. So I think domestic restoration is absolutely essential. And then, as I said earlier, doing a lot of just hard work, a lot of sort of country by country hard work to restore alliances and partnerships that have been eroded in many cases in the Indo-Pacific or the Asia-Pacific, in Europe. The good news for the United States, and I think that for a prospective, Biden-Harris administration, I think that the good news is that there is, especially in light of the way that China has conducted itself during the course of the pandemic with its wolf warrior diplomacy, I think that there is a tremendous opportunity if the United States acts to restore those alliances and partnerships. It's not to say that we're going back to pre-Trump administration. There's a lot of hard work that needs to be done. The United States needs to do a lot to assure its allies and partners that this America First proclivity, it's more of an aberration than a harbinger. So there's a lot of hard work that has to be done, but I do think that there's an eagerness for the United States to come back, not to come back and to dictate to others that, thou shalt do this, but just to make common cause as part of a coalition. So before we even think about China, domestic restoration occurring in parallel with diplomatic renewal, and those two are inextricably intertwined. And I think that to the extent, and the reason that I mentioned that is that I think that our strategy and our policy vis-a-vis China, they're a crucial aspect of U.S. foreign policy, but I don't think that they should be determinative. I think that we should first figure out where it is that we're trying to go, and then think about how competition with China fits in. My own preference would be for the United States to resume its role as a galvanizer of collective action. For all the talk about decoupling, deglobalization, are we returning to the 1930s? It seems to me that there is an imbalance, and that the rhetoric about deglobalization and the rhetoric about sort of autarky and nationalism, a lot of that rhetoric outpaces the reality, which is that the challenges begotten by and exacerbated by globalization, they're not going anywhere. Climate change is here to stay, and it's getting worse. There are some observers who believe that even as we're dealing with COVID-19, the next pandemic is already around the corner because of the way that human beings conduct themselves and the way that societies organize themselves. So transnational challenges are not going anywhere. And so there is a need for, and not just for one actor, there is a need for a patchwork of actors, state actors, businesses, philanthropies, non-state actors, a patchwork of actors who can collectively engage in two types of collective action. One is sort of short-term emergency collective action. So when fires emerge, literally or figuratively, when crises emerge, emergency mobilization. And then there's sort of a second kind of more incremental, patient, long-term mobilization, collective action that's needed to build up systemic resilience in the international system. And I do think that the United States, even though it is in relative decline, even though I think that its image in the world has undergone a lot of strain during this administration, I do think that the United States, given the size of its economy, given its experience with capacity building, with mobilizing collective action, I still do think that it is exceptionally well poised to resume that role. And if the United States resumes that role and gets back in the economic game, gets back in the technology game, so that it has the wherewithal to anchor that mobilizing role, then I think we'll be in a much better place to think about how we can get out of this sort of tit for tat retaliatory cycle that we're in with China now, and think about how we compartmentalize cooperative and competitive dynamics. I think competitive dynamics, they're going to endure. I think that they, at this point, are basically an inbuilt feature, not a bug. They're an inbuilt feature of the US-China relationship. But I think that we should escape, if we resume that role as a convener of collective action, we get our own house in order, we pair it with diplomatic restoration, I think that we'll then have the ability to right-size the China challenge and say, here are places where we need to selectively compete, shape the regional environment in which China is operating, shaping the global environment that China surveys, but identifying areas for cooperation. And as I said earlier, there is no long-term tenable solution or mitigation to climate change, pandemic disease, or a whole host of other challenges begotten by globalization that doesn't involve China. And so, so again, it's domestic renewal in tandem with diplomatic restoration, resuming that collective action, mobilize a role, and right-sizing the China challenge. And then I'll stop here. I think that I like, so Jude Blanchett of the Center for Strategic and International Studies had a great piece that he wrote a couple of weeks ago, or maybe a couple of months ago at this point, in talking about right-sizing the China challenge. He said, China isn't 2 feet tall, but it's not 10 feet tall. He said, maybe it's 6'9". And the idea is that China is a formidable competitor. It's a multifaceted competitor, and our response to China necessarily and properly will be a critical part of U.S. foreign policy, but it should advance an affirmative vision, not subsume the entire undertaking of American grand strategy. And I think that that distinction is very important.